37 of Acts. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea, along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salome. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that they were all brought safely to land. This is the word of God. Please be seated.
Thank you, sister. It's a long passage. Well,
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was a long haul for you. Thank you. Gary, are you preaching next week? Are you closing out? 2 more messages. Well, thanks for leading us this far. Thanks, Gary. We'll be taking communion at the end today. It'll be the same as always, except we'll take one element at a time, just FYI on that. It's amazing at times what one decision, one conversation, one question can change the direction of your life. How the Lord will use it for His purposes in ways you never really imagined. You might be thinking, I really blew this. I made the wrong decision. Maybe decision makers outside of me have affected my life. I sense a little feedback. I'm just living my life. I'm walking with the Lord. And now this life event has just happened. And it's common to say, where's God in the midst of all this? Decisions we make or those who make them for us have consequences. Paul in Acts 22, if we've seen a long time ago, is arrested and about to be flogged for creating a public nuisance of all things. And Paul's question changes the whole direction of his life for the next 2 years. Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen? Then the following night, the Lord appears to Paul and says, take courage, because you've got to go to Rome. That's where I'm sending you. You're going to testify about me. From here, Paul goes to trial with Festus, and it's here that Paul appeals to Rome for justice, thinking he's going to get a fair shake at trial in Rome than he will in Jerusalem. And he's probably right about that, isn't he? And so Paul is put in the custody of this centurion named Julius, as was read. Rome didn't have ships. They contracted them out, and Julius is looking for a ship that is a part of the imperial grain fleet. They would haul grain from Egypt to Rome. And Paul is on this ship. And they're trying to keep close to the land as they travel, right? 276 people are on board. And when they are caught in what the Bible calls the northeaster, which is really a hurricane, everything starts to get a little bit serious in life real quick, doesn't it? It's been calculated that Paul has sailed over 3,000 miles, so he knows what he's talking about when it comes to ships. In verse 9, it says it's after the fast. It's the dangerous sailing season. That's from 14 September to 11 November. Then Paul, in verse 10, jumps in with his experience with sailing in this area and says, listen to me, don't do it. Let's just stay right here. It's safe right here where we're at. Well, folks don't listen to prisoners, do they? The centurion, the pilot, and the owner of the ship decide, no, we're going to go towards a better place for the winter. Decisions we make have consequences. Verse 13, they feel the gentle south wind blowing on them and decide now is the time to set sail. If you will, it's the proverbial calm before the storm. Sometimes the decisions we make results in suffering and trying times, storms, if you will. We've prayed about it. We've talked to people around us. We sense God's leading. We feel the gentle south wind upon our souls, and we decide, let's go. God is leading us. Let's move out. These last chapters could be called the sufferings of Paul. Verse 20, there's no sun, no stars. The storm continued to rage. And they felt what in verse 20? They felt there was no hope of being saved. That's how serious things were on this ship. In our life, our sufferings are often seen as storms that come upon us. So tremendous, so overwhelming. We feel at times there's just no hope for us. We're just in the winds being tossed to and fro. What else could happen to us this day? So I want to look at Paul as he sails through the storm that he's facing, and we can see how we can handle the storms of life, so to speak. But I want you to understand this one thing. God is in the midst of the storms of life. He's not letting you flail about all by yourself. We'll look at storms confused, they challenge us, and they confirm who God is. So first off, storms confuse us at times, dismay us, if you will. Do you know what a paradox is? A paradox is a statement that's seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, and yet it's perhaps true. So in verse 22, Paul says, yet now I urge you to take heart. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and to whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. Everybody is scared. If you've ever been on a ship that's tossing to or fro or a small boat, it is scary. They've been in this storm, and they're starting to think they're not going to make it. But this angel appears to Paul, right? And he's bringing encouragement, and he says, everyone will survive. He says, God has granted you all those who sail with you, suggesting that Paul was probably praying for 276 souls on this ship. And the angel comes and says, God has granted you, everyone will survive. Only the boat will be lost. It will run aground on an island. So Paul, don't be afraid. Be strong. Look at verse 30 to 31. We're told that the sailors pretended to be laying out anchors in the sea, but were in fact attempting to escape. These men were scared and wanted to try their chances in the lifeboat. But Paul discovers this and tells the centurion, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. We can't handle the ship without these folks. And so the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboats and let it go. Chris, I just need to jump in here. What's up with the Navy? The Army's taking the lead here, bud. I'm not quite sure what's going on. All right. But, well, because of this event, the Army-Navy game is still hotly contested. But do you notice the paradox? Something here just doesn't seem to make sense. First, Paul says, God has spoken, no one's going to die. If a prophet gives a prophecy and it doesn't come true, he's to be killed, stoned. Paul would never say that everyone's going to be saved unless he knew it was true. It comes from God himself. So Paul had no doubt that what God was good to his word. Yet when he sees the men leaving the ship, he says, we can't make it. We'll not survive. There seems to be a problem here, a contradiction, a paradox going on. In our thinking, if God had said everyone will be saved, who cares if the sailors get into the lifeboats and go, bon voyage, go ahead. We'll see you on land. But that's not what happens. Sometimes in our thinking, if God is totally in charge, then our choices don't matter. Or we believe that if our choices do matter, then God is not as involved in our lives as he should be. Involved in my circumstances. He must be holding back. It must be dependent on me. Do or die. We like it to be either or. We think God is doing it all, or I'd better make some good decisions because everything's on my shoulders. It's not let go and let God. Nor does he think that the storm that he's in must mean that he's walking outside the will of God. How many times have we thought that? Have I blown it? Am I outside where God wants me to be because I've hit resistance in my life? Tragedy? I think the Bible shows us that it's both and. I think God is totally in control and our actions do matter. All things are determined by God, the good, the bad, the large, the small. And Paul is assuming that everything is happening for a reason, the good and the bad. What we face on a daily basis is determined by God. It is God that holds it all together. Yet what we do matters. The choices we make, the decisions that have to be made, there are consequences for the decisions that we make. Yet we are free. And yet we are responsible. It's not either or, but is God holding it together? We like to think at times God does it all and I'm free, I can make decisions. Maybe it's 50-50, me and God, or 80-20. But I think the Bible shows us it's 100-100. I think Paul is saying that God is 100% in charge, and our choices do matter. Genesis 50, verse 20, we have Joseph at the very end of his life. Well, not the end of his life, but the very end of the story with his brothers, right? Very famous passage. And Joseph says there's the evil intent by the brothers, but also the good intent of God. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Brothers, your actions were wrong. They were evil. You put me in jeopardy. I'm hurting. I went through all this because of you. You're at fault. But God took your actions and used them for my good and for the good of the people of Egypt. God uses the Assyrian king to punish Israel in Isaiah 10, right? In verse 12, God will punish the same king for his sinful actions. Why? Because the king's pride is in thinking he had accomplished it by his own might. That's the problem. Or in Peter's first sermon in Acts chapter 2, Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, it says. Jesus' death was planned from eternity past. God foreordained it. And yet Peter continues, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Everyone who was a part of the death of Christ was in trouble. They were a part of the evil. God held them accountable. And so in Acts 27, God has determined that all will live, yet the sailors must take responsibility. In order for them to be saved from drowning, they must stay on the ship, or we're lost. And so God ordains what is to happen through our choices. It's not 50-50, it's 100-100. So that when the storms of life hit us, when tough times come, I think we have to understand this paradox in our lives. What I do matters, and yet it's helpful to know that you are not alone. You are not in the whirlwind of circumstances that are completely out of your control. It's satisfying to know that life is not out of control, that God is still there. He has not left you alone. He's not saying, hey, well, listen, Wes, you made a mess of this. I'm out of it. You go ahead and clean up your own mess here. God has a plan for you. I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. And we see it here with Paul. Paul's not passive. He's not saying, sailors, do whatever you like. We're good. We'll see you on shore. No. He goes to the centurion. He warns the sailors, you've got to stay on the ship. He's leading. He's taking charge. He's warning the people. As one writer says, if it was all destined, then Paul would have been passive, watching events unfold. But what kind of emotional state is Paul in? He's calm. On the other hand, if life and limb are dependent on the decisions that he is going to make in the critical moments, how would Paul have been acting? If it was all up to him, would he feel the pressure and the panic? Wouldn't there be sweat on his brows? There's 276 people that might die. He'd be wondering if the next decision was the right one. But if it was all up to God, he'd be apathetic. Paul is neither passive nor panicked. He's making good decisions. He's encouraging people. Eat some food. Get your strength up. And this is where the comfort comes into play in our lives. That we're going to be making the decisions. Not all of them are going to be good. And we think we're sunk, but it's not. God is still there. In the end, we cannot mess up God's plans for our lives. This should provide us with a sense of comfort and peace that God has not left us alone. He's still there. We are not off course from God's plan for us. A paradox is comfort for today and hope for tomorrow. We'd like to think that the meaning and significance of our lives depends on what we do for ourselves. But the Bible shows us that the goal of human life is to glorify God. Our meaning is found not in what we do, but in what God has done for us and in us. Secondly, storms challenge us. In verse 33, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. I think it's a good question to ask. Why does God send storms into our lives? Why do we have such difficulty at times? Life seems to be going so well. Something happens. We like the calm. We like the uninterrupted weeks of life, the months that go on, problem-free days. But the storms challenge us. They throw us into a crisis mode. And storms can hurt. There's no doubt. They can bring tears to our eyes. They can hurt our hearts. They can take the wind out of our sails. Storms are not easy at times. But it should also deepen our faith. It should challenge us to look at God and not ourselves. Storms reveal our faith or even the lack of faith at times. And that's okay. It's all right to show the lack of faith as long as you come back into port towards God. Oswald Chambers says, to choose suffering makes no sense at all. To choose God's will in the midst of suffering makes all the sense in the world. Boy, I love that. Not always easy, but I love that quote. Choosing God's will in the midst of suffering, that's the key right there. Verse 33, Paul is encouraging the people on board to eat. He's encouraging them. He's strengthening them. It's been days without sunshine, visibility. You can't see around you. There's no GPS. Why would you even consider eating if the ship is rocking back and forth so violently? I bet seasickness was rampant. Yet in verse 34, when Luke is writing, not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And by the way, Luke is on board with him. You notice in this chapter 17 times he says we, okay? So Luke is there. I wonder if Luke remembers the words he wrote of Jesus in Luke 21. In verse 16 it says, you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls. Jesus says there will be persecution. Some of you will die. You will certainly be hated, but not a hair of your head will be lost. There's that paradox thing going on again, right here. The NIV in verse 19 says, stand firm and you will win life. The ESV says, by your endurance you will gain your lives. The King James Version says, in your patience possess ye your souls. One writer says it could be rendered, for by your endurance you will make your lives secure. I think what Luke is saying here is those who endure will win their eternal souls. He's telling us that our salvation is sure in Christ. Even if death comes, our souls are secure in Him. The loss of life is no greater than the loss of a single hair. Yet, as one writer says, unless you suffer, you don't really possess your souls. Well, that's an interesting statement to make, isn't it? I think what he means here is if we live for something other than God, that's what owns you. That's where your soul belongs. That's what rules your heart. If you live for your job owns you. If you live only for your children or your bank account, it has you, it consumes you, it motivates you. At times it depresses you, it brings you down. It shows you the fragility of what you're living for. If you live for anything but God, you don't possess your souls. It doesn't belong to God. You're living for something else, some idol. Something else has supplanted God. So what is it that runs your life today? What owns you if it's not God? Whatever it is, it has your heart and it has your soul. Something else possesses your soul. And so these storms come into our lives. They shake us up. They throw us against the wall at times. They hurt. We cry. We wonder. We weep. That's okay. It's normal. It's a part of that, okay? It's okay to hurt. All the great planning, all the solid goals, all the right living, all the effort to be good in the midst of this, and we see that the storm has shown us that our foundation is sand, it's not on Jesus Christ. That our walk was shallow in this one area. And when you realize that your foundation is sand and you've come to the end of your rope, so to speak, when you've hit bottom, then you can reorient your life on Jesus Christ. And you realize that you weren't walking by faith and trusting in Him. Storms can help us know ourselves. I haven't grown through the easy times. I've grown through the rough times. I've made a mess of a lot of times. Probably like you. That's how I've grown. It shows us what our faith is made of or what it's not. Is our faith really centered on Jesus or on ourselves, our efforts? What's going on here? We don't think of storms this way. It usually comes in and it crushes us. But storms, can we say, are good for us? Can we say that? We've got to say that. When I say that if we don't suffer, then we don't possess our souls, we know then that God is greater. He's bigger than the storm and the event in our lives. He's bigger than that. Clarity has come, and we know that we belong to Jesus. Oh, do I hurt? Do I cry? Do I suffer? Yes, but we belong to Jesus. Back to Joseph again and his brothers. Sold him to strangers, threw him in a pit. He spends 13 years in prison. Joseph, as a teenager, wasn't on a godly path in his early life. He flaunted a dream that he'd rule over his brothers. He paraded around in a fancy coat like a royal king, right? Yet what does Joseph say when he confronts his brothers again, right? The same thing. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Can we stop for a moment and just grasp the idea that the storms of life are meant for good? Doesn't feel like it at the time. Doesn't feel like it when somebody has a cancer treatment coming up, where life might be ebbing, things are not going well, lost your job, financial market crashed. Doesn't feel like it. What you're going through right now is meant for your good. It's easy to say, I got it. Much more difficult to live through. I'm with you on that. But we've got to stop somewhere. We've got to land somewhere. The foundation is Jesus Christ. We don't have that foundation, we're really going to go through the storms, tossed back and forth tremendously. What you may not see is the good today the way Joseph did. For Joseph to say, hey, God meant it for good, that was 13, 15, 20 years after all the events. You might not see it that day in the midst of it. Right? It might take some time to process that one. He was put in the place of leadership to save the people of Egypt. But we walk by faith. Blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. Storms are also for our godliness. If you look at the storms in the book of Job, if you can plow through the whole book one of these days, and you remember that early on in the chapters of Job, God takes his children from a storm. It was high winds. It blows over the house. His children are killed. Throughout the rest of the book, Job is saying, I want to talk with God. I want to see him. I have some things to say. But he's always a little fearful that God is going to use a storm to come in and kill him the way he killed his family. So in chapter 9, Job fears that he'll be crushed by a storm. Job 30, he says, you snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. And yet in 38 and 40, God finally appears in the story. He appears to Job. He's about to talk to him. God speaks to Job. How does he speak to Job? From the storm. I imagine that Job saw that storm and got in it and thought he was through. But he survives the storm. To choose God's will in the midst of suffering, the storm, makes all the sense in the world. We need to realize that what Job came to see, that God is in the storm. He has not left you on your own. Yes, storms will rattle you, but if you strengthen your heart on Jesus, if your inner commitment is fixated on the cross of Christ and on Him, then that overcomes the outward pressures of storms in life that comes in your life. So that the next time the storms come in your life, you'll know what it means to walk by faith a little bit better than you did the time before. Patient endurance gives you the possession of your soul because your heart is His and you know it. That's what it's all about. You know that you know that you know you belong to Jesus in the midst of that storm. As Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they rest in you. Thirdly, storms confirm who God is. Do you notice Paul's demeanor and attitude, his presence? How is Paul in the midst of the storm? How does he handle himself like this? We've seen Paul in these pages as a leader, a guide, a counselor, one who inspires. He was a man of strength. Verse 33, listen, you need to eat. You will not lose a single hair from your head. They ate the food and got back to work. Wouldn't it be nice to be like this when the next storms come into our lives? But how? I have found that suffering doesn't always make you godly or a better Christian at times. It can. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes when bad things happen, the storms, the health scare, the loss of a loved one, whatever it is, you tell me. Our response is, where is God? Oh my goodness, what is going on? Why has he abandoned me? We go through a checklist of questions. Am I being punished? What did I do wrong? Why am I by myself? Why doesn't he care about my situation? Because if he did, I wouldn't have this situation right now. I wouldn't be in the midst of this. But this isn't Paul, is it? How does Paul handle this? Paul has a sense of the presence of God in the midst of the storm. Now, for everyone else, it feels like death's door is knocking. They're about ready to die. Paul knows he's in the hands of God. There's two phrases that give us the clue right here in this chapter. The first is in verse 23, the God whom I belong. This is the language of possession. Paul is saying, God is with me. There's a sense in Paul's life that you are not your own, you were bought with a price. That is Paul. Divine ownership is on Paul's life, and he knows it. The Almighty has him in his hands, and this fact, this truth, brings him comfort and hope in the midst of the storm. Yes, storms can make us better, can make us stronger Christians. And we stop for a minute in the midst of all and practice the presence of God. Take a deep breath in the midst of worry. Wipe away the tears. Face the bewilderment. Face the hurt. And say, God, I belong to you. And be swayed by his love for us. Lord, I surrender to you in this crisis. It's in these moments that we realize his possession of us. Our souls, our hearts, we are his. We belong to him. He's not left us alone. He's in the storm. Isn't this the gospel? That we get God for ourselves if we give ourselves to God by faith in Jesus Christ. To put it another way, and this is the covenant that I will make with them after these days, says the Lord. I will be their God, and they will be my people. That's language of possession. That's language of hope. That's language of care, awareness of our troubles, a relationship with him. Because why? We are his people. And the second phrase is, whom I serve. The same verse, right? Whom I belong is inward, right? Whom I serve is outward. Don't our minds go automatically to, we shall love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and mind, and our neighbors as ourselves, right? It should. The inward assurance results in the outward demonstration of our faith in Christ. Do you see it in Paul? Calmness. Verse 22, keep up your courage. There's Paul. He gives them encouragement. He gives them hope. None of you will be lost. And Paul is common sensed in verse 33. 2 weeks without food. Everyone eats some food. You know, we lose our grip on life when we don't sleep, we don't eat, and we're not encouraged by others. That's why we need the church. That's why we need one another. That's why we meet on Sunday mornings. And when you help others by being encouraging and common sensed, You provide hope. That is your service. As Paul says, whom I serve. Can you do those three things? I bet you all can. I bet you can. I bet you're doing it now. That inward devotion manifests itself in the outward love towards others, service to others, encouraging to others. Paul's service was loving the Lord his God with all his heart and soul and mind, while everyone else on board would be thinking that death is sure. Paul's love for his neighbor was eat, pray, be encouraged. Notice that on this ship, 2 weeks in a hurricane, you can't see the land. The boat is rocking so violently that they have to put cables around the ship. I tried to find a book that explained how they would do that in the midst of a storm. I just couldn't find anything. But storms have a way of revealing our character. We can't hide behind the trite social Christian graces. I am fine. Please pray for me. Everything's good, right? We do that, don't we? I do it, don't we? I'm fine, but inside you're dying. There's panic, but not for Paul. Remember his words, the God to whom I belong, the God whom I serve. Faith is the true life preserver in the midst of the storm. Do you see the difference between where is God and the God to whom I belong? Do you see the difference there? There's a difference. That is the intersection of faith and the feeling of abandonment. That's the difference. So how can we know that you haven't been abandoned by God? That we're not being punished? That the storm we are in isn't God's judgment on us? How can we know that the storm we experience can make us better Christians? There is a storm that we do deserve. Everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We do not love God with all our heart and soul and mind. At times, boy, we certainly don't love our neighbor as ourselves. I hear another Christian say, we need to love ourselves more before we do something for somebody. Oh, gosh, that's terrible. We do that. That's the problem. We love ourselves too much. We deserve the storm of God's wrath. If we believe in Jesus, we know that he took the storm of God's wrath so that we don't have to. He was abandoned in his suffering. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? Jesus bore the suffering, the storm of suffering for us. He suffered so that when we suffer, we know it's not God's punishment on our lives. Oh, hang on to that one. Monday's coming. Hang on to that one. Jesus took on the storm of God's wrath so that we don't have to. The storms we will face is a part of the sort of sinfulness and brokenness of the world that we live in. We must say with Paul, the God to whom I belong. That's relationship. Are you suffering? God has suffered for you. Have you been betrayed? Jesus was betrayed. Is your body not functioning well? Well, Jesus' body was crucified on the cross. He knows what suffering is all about. He died so that we do not have to die. And now we have God by faith. We have relationship. We have communion with him. We have fellowship with God. We are there in his family. I will be their God, and they will be my people. The God to whom I belong. So as we prepare to take communion with the God to whom we belong, the first Lord's Supper was a covenant-making ceremony. It was the new covenant, was it not? It was a Passover meal. The main course was the lamb. They were to eat the lamb and smear the blood on the lamb on the doorpost, right? So when the angel of judgment comes over it, he sees the blood and he passes over that house so that the firstborn of the household would not be killed. What God was saying is that everyone has sinned, everyone was selfish, everyone was their own gods. It is required of every family in Egypt to admit that night that they would not survive the judgment, that they need forgiveness of sins. Every family had to admit they need the blood of the Lamb to cover them in their household. We need to admit that we need the blood of the Lamb over us. The Israelites were bound perpetually to remember the Passover meal and to eat it with their families. Jesus being the culmination of the years of animal sacrifices, now we are called to perpetually remember his death. The one thing he calls us to do is to remember his death. So he stands. He takes the bread, which is his body. He takes the cup, which is his blood. But where's the main course? Where's the lamb? What kind of a meal is this with the bread and the wine, but there's no lamb? Jesus is the lamb. He never refers to the lamb. Jesus is saying, I'm your substitute. I died on the cross. I bled, so my blood covers you. If we put the cross at the center of our thinking in the Lord's Supper, we realize that the supper, when we drink the cup, Jesus has purchased us a new life. By faith, by his blood, we can say with Paul, the God to whom I belong. We have relationship. We are part of the family. We're in his household. We are not by ourselves. God is in the storms. We have come to become his people, and he has become our God. He knows our suffering because he has suffered. He has become our all-satisfying God, by which from the deep within us, in our souls, we can cry out, Abba, Father. That's not just a matter of fact. It is a heart declaration that we belong to Jesus. We have relationship. We have possession. He possesses us. We're like the prodigal son. Welcome home. We have been mugged and robbed and left for dead on the side of the road, and the Good Samaritan comes by and he pays for our care. That's what he does. I am his. So when we take the bread and the cup of the new covenant, we believe that God is our God and we are his. The God to whom we belong.